Hello, folks. Welcome to the third session of the Race for Autonomy series. My name is Gonawela. I am a co-host. We have been creating this with Ellen Chang from BMNT. This series to really dissect whether the DoD is at a good place on the race for autonomy, whether we can win the race for autonomy, and how the DoD can leverage the commercial sector to enhance these opportunities in developing autonomous systems and capabilities. So we had a great first session in June, which is linked in this description. And since we had that first panel, we had a great fireside chat with the Center for Naval Analyses, Dr. David Broyles. And today we are honored to be joined by Dr. Jim Bellingham from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Bellingham is a pioneer in the worldwide autonomous marine robotics field, and he has led research expeditions from the Arctic to the Antarctic. He's the executive director, actually, of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Assured Autonomy in Baltimore. And for more than 30 years, Dr. Bellingham has been a global leader in the development of small, high-performance autonomous underwater vehicles, which we'll refer to as AUVs, which has resulted in a class of systems that are now widely used within the military, industry, and science communities. So very relevant for our conversations. And Dr. Bellingham has been very instrumental in innovations for ocean observing and has spent considerable time at sea, leading around 24 AUV expeditions in locations across the Antarctic, North Atlantic, Mediterranean, South Pacific, and Arctic. So Dr. Bellingham, we're going to have a great conversation about your 30-year career, about historic and new developments in the state of autonomy. So Dr. Bellingham, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Well, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this conversation, and thank you to Ellen as well, who I know is off screen here. So glad to be with you.
Awesome. So Dr. Bellingham, in our panel, initial panel in June, which had 4 speakers from both the private and the public sector, and then in my last fireside chat with CNA's Dr. David Broyles, it seemed like all of the speakers referred to the state of autonomy as being brittle. What's your take on that?
Yeah. So I think that, the brittleness might have to do with the fact that 2 things. One is the way we've succeeded is by using these systems with enormous numbers of degrees of freedom to describe data sets which are much more limited in extent. I mean, complicated, but limited in extent. So we end up with this under-constrained learning system, and maybe it shouldn't be a surprise. The result is systems which have lots of sort of unconstrained, if you will, regions in their feature space. So so in effect, local minima, and so those are that's one part of the problem, right? Is that we have under-constrained a lot of our learning systems, and there are approaches to dealing with that. And then I would say, the second piece really has to do with the fact that almost all of our engineering disciplines revolve around systems that we can kind of analytically describe. And if you think of classical, dynamical control, we have methods for proving performance of these systems. We actually don't have that. A lot of our learning systems now are really functionally black boxes to us. They give us really impressive results. They have solved a lot of vision problems that were intractable not so long ago, but at the cost of some very quirky performance at times, which pops up in unexpected and unpleasant and sometimes unpleasant ways. And so as a consequence, we don't even understand necessarily all of the failure modes of the systems that we're building, which makes it very hard for us to assure performance, and very scary in a way to build larger complex systems of systems with these pieces as components. And in fact, that's really kind of the central motivation, if you will, for this new institute that I'm running, this Institute for Assured Autonomy, is to really take on these problems, both in a theoretical sense. So are there different things that you should be doing in machine learning? Should you be constraining the machine learning algorithms in certain ways to in effect remove some of those degrees of freedom, or smooth out, if you will, some of those local minima? And then functionally, what is the process by which one actually engineers with these? I mean, how do you go from sort of the laboratory development of machine learning systems across to systems which you can deploy and which you can say something about what the performance will be? And the fact that it's taking so very long in the autonomous car space, is a clue. It's a clue that this is hard. It's a lot harder than we thought. And if you think about carrying it across, or to some than perhaps some of us thought, right? Because you can easily see as you work with autonomous cars, right? They talk a lot about edge cases. And they keep uncovering more and more edge cases. And a number of my colleagues give great talks on this. John Leonard from MIT gave a great presentation to us here, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago. And John has done a marvelous job of just outlining some of the edge cases that they encounter in testing. John has a position at both, MIT and Toyota. And they include circumstances in the autonomous car world, like, sometimes a human driver has to actually violate the rules of the road because you encounter some special circumstances. There's some construction going on and you have to drive into oncoming traffic to go around it. As a matter of fact, where I live in Baltimore, every morning I have to do that. There's always someone parallel parking or someone who's pulled up who's emptying their groceries. And to get around them, I have to drive into that oncoming lane. And John has sort of a beautiful job, does a beautiful job of sort of describing that in the autonomous car space. But you take it across to medicine, you take it across to military systems, you take it across to the financial system, and you begin to see sort of the full dimensions of the challenge, right? Because it manifests in different ways in different places. In the autonomous car world, it's a safety issue. It's a management issue in terms of how do you structure systems to operate safely if you can't guarantee their performance. It turns out we aren't doing a very good job of that, I would argue. But if you come across to the medical space, you deal with a sort of different problems, right? You have to worry about privacy. And we know now that a lot of these systems trained off of these very rich but old data sets have a lot of bias built into them, right? A lot of bias. So they are built on data sets which maybe have people all with one skin pigmentation or very few samples of another. And so as a consequence, the vision systems might be very good identifying skin lesions in one space for one group of users, and pretty useless for another group of users. So there's issues of bias, equity, and privacy and security, all of which begin to roll in and play very prominent roles in that domain. And so, I can go on and on about this legal system. There's a number of examples there of machine learning systems having gone horribly wrong and people having been incarcerated who were in fact innocent. I mean, it's bail bonds being set unreasonably high for one group of non-offenders, who happen to be of one particular race, while other folks who are repeat offenders from a different race end up with very low bail bonds. So there's really big issues here. And these problems are not just an autonomous car or a weapons problem, but they're pervasive and have enormous societal effects. These things are either going to give us a more equitable prosperous world, or they're going to take all of our current problems and amplify them. And, whether we really develop the engineering to do this right is going to determine sort of which of those paths we go on.
So Dr. Bellingham, that was a great overview of your perspective on the state of autonomy.
Yeah.
From my introduction, I mean, our audience, you can tell that Dr. Bellingham has a wealth of experience over a great career. So Dr. Bellingham, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? Let us know a little bit about your career and your work on AUVs.
Yeah, so I started out as my training is as a physicist. So I went through MIT undergraduate and graduate, got a PhD in physics, and although I haven't worked as a physicist really since my postdoc period. It was really formative for me because my initial approaches to robotics were as observation systems. So I thought of them as instruments really. And so after graduation, I had been talking to this group in the MIT Sea Grant program while I was going through my PhD work. And they were trying to get this autonomous underwater vehicle program going. And they had had a couple of false starts. And they had finally decided they were going to take a chunk of their own money as seed money and give this sort of a several year worth of running funding to get off the ground and going. And they advertised for a position. And I remember walking down the infinite corridor at MIT in my cutoff jeans and t-shirt and seeing this advertisement and calling them up and saying, I'd like to come in and talk to you at some point. And they go, well, how about right now? So I walked in in my very informal wear and walked out with a job to set that lab up and run it. So I had known them before, but I had never worked in the marine domain, right? So I was really, my primary background was in low temperature physics and magnetometry. My only exposure to the ocean was working as a volunteer with Doc Edgerton, running his sonar system. So to say I was at the bottom of a steep learning curve would be not an exaggeration. Fortunately, nobody else was really doing it at the time. So the autonomous systems, it existed. There were a few groups around the country, but it was a very small venture at that point. And so there was a lot of room to come in and innovate. And fortunately, there were a lot of things going on at MIT, including work at Rodney Brooks's lab, that provided a very interesting sort of angle on autonomy, right? This is basically, I'm referring to the subsumption architecture, layered control. And so Rodney had a very minimalistic approach towards autonomy. His comment was always, insects are successful. They're not doing world modeling, or at least we don't think they are. So maybe we're overcomplicating the problem. And so we developed a set of architectures, around those. And my initial vehicles were, testbed vehicles. But then I very quickly realized that testbed vehicles were only going to take us so far, and that you were solving a lot of problems that were peculiar to swimming pools, not necessarily the ocean. And also, your sponsors really wanted to see these things go to sea, so I had several sponsors tell me, well, look, I funded this work. It never really seems to go anywhere. If you're not going to take it out of the lab, I'm not really going to fund you. So I tried to team with oceanographic institutions back at that time, but they kind of had their own ventures and they weren't so interested in teaming. And the breakthrough for me was when a woman who later became my boss, Marcia McNutt, who's a professor at MIT, contacted me saying that she was involved in a cruise. The cruise had been shifted. It was an Antarctic cruise. It was going to be out for 2 months. It was now going out over Christmas and New Year's, and a lot of the people who were supposed to go on the cruise had dropped out. If I would go in and, be one of the science party there operating sort of their instrumentation program, I could bring my AUV stuff along and they'd give me some ship days to operate it. And, oh, by the way, you've got 2 months. So, to pull everything together, and our vehicles had only been operated in the Charles River. So, I went back to my lab and I said, this is really exciting. Who wants to go with me? And everyone goes, are you insane? We've only operated in the Charles River. What folks didn't know was that our funding wasn't really looking that great at that point, right? We had 3 big proposals in, 2 of which seemed like they were a sure thing. One of which got killed when the company reorganized. One just simply wasn't funded, and the other one was out there still, but it was now looking dicey. And from my perspective, if we didn't do something dramatic, and really show that we were sort of going to take these things to see, it wasn't clear that the lab had a future. So to make a long story short, we went to Antarctica. We got the vehicles to operate there in very simple ways. Brought back some kind of cool data that was sort of a teaser. And O&R and O&R program manager Tom Curtin came by, and Tom, there's many people who've influenced my career. Tom is certainly up there at the top of the list. Tom sort of, he ran the Arctic program at the time at O&R, or I think it was called the High Latitude program. And Tom looked at that stuff and said, oh my gosh, you're willing to go to sea. He goes, I've got an ice camp coming up in a year. Can you guys be ready? And so that was, so a year later, we were up in an ice camp up at the Beaufort Sea in the Arctic Ocean, and that led to a whole interaction with O&R, which ultimately led to this program called Autonomous Ocean Sampling Networks, where we actually built whole networks of systems, tied them into real-time models, which made predictions, which told us where to send the vehicles to do, to improve the observations and improve the model performance. And that ran into multiple cycles, and so there was a whole set of things that came out of that initial O&R interaction. We spun a company out, Bluefin Robotics. I call that kind of defensive entrepreneurship. My big problem was we were getting more requests for vehicles in our laboratory, and the sponsors really wanted these vehicles to end up in other people's hands. And I didn't want to do that. Effectively, I was taking all of my people and building stuff for other people. So I said, wow, we should really turn this into a company. So we did. We formed Bluefin Robotics out of that, which is now owned by General Dynamics. And so that was kind of the whole introduction to entrepreneurship for me. The real engine behind that was Frank Van Mierlo, who was an old friend of mine from undergraduate days. And Frank came over and turned all of that fuzzy technology into a real company, and then ended up out on the West Coast working for David Packard. So at any rate, it kind of all started from those initial roots of first kind of figuring out what the problems were. A lot of the things that we thought were really hard turned out not to be hard. We learned those from test beds. Some of the things we sort of took for granted turned out to be almost impossible. Navigation. So the autonomy piece of it wasn't as hard, right? It was able to, making systems that worked in the ocean turned out to be something which, if you boiled it down, you could make that a tractable problem. But knowing where your vehicle was, now that was a really tough problem. And if you're building a science platform, as one scientist put it to me, if you can't tell me where the data's from, don't bother coming back. So those were kind of the formative years for me. And then learning, then sort of moving across to the operational side and actually operating the systems that I built. Boy, that was, sort of one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, because it was a different type of activity. At the same time, one of the most rewarding, because you really learned what the real problems were. And so there was a period when all of my proposals were funded because we were coming back from, these field programs, and I had a very clear picture of, what the problems were and how to move forward on them. So at any rate, that's a bit of my background. You can imagine why the assurance piece of it became so important to me. The assurance piece became important because you're sticking multi-million-dollar pieces of hardware into the ocean cumulatively, maybe, many tens of millions of dollars of hardware into the ocean, and you really want it to come back and you really want it to function well. And so the assurance piece of it really became a central part of what we did. And I kind of joke that if you're developing a vehicle, for every dollar you spend sort of inventing something new, you spend $9 making sure it'll work in the ocean. And
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Bellingham, in our last conversation with Dr. David Broyles, he sort of referred to this thing called an AI winter, and then we in turn talked about an AI summer, sort of these seasons in AI development where, momentum will sort of heat up, and then momentum may just cool down and sometimes just stop. So in your 30 years, you've described a very interesting career. Have you sort of observed winters and summers in the development of these autonomous capabilities where momentum would have heated up and momentum would have slowed down? And I guess when were those, and how did those play out? Like, why did momentum slow down or heat up?
Yeah, so I was a bit of an out of cycle with the rest of the AI autonomy community. I would have to say, for us, if you wanted to build an untethered system that went in the ocean, and maybe I should take a step back and say, what are alternatives to what we do? Well, what people did was they went into the ocean in human-occupied vehicles. Super expensive. Alvin is probably $50,000 a day. Average bottom time is somewhere around 4 hours. So you can do the math. You're spending, well over $10,000 for every hour you spend on the bottom, with that system. And then remotely operated vehicles came along, and Bob Ballard was, kind of the original proponent for those in the scientific community. They'd been kind of largely invented in the defense and then very rapidly adopted in oil and gas. But the scientific community was kind of slow to adopt them. But Bob really was an innovator there. I kind of view him to some degree as one of the fathers of marine robotics in an odd way, right? Because he recruited a group of individuals to build these ROV systems. And the ROV systems are very capable, right? You can put tens of kilowatts of power down. You can have all kinds of bandwidth up to the surface, supporting cameras and other instruments, but you're tethered to a ship, right? You've got this thing that's maybe the size of a garden hose or bigger, depending on what kind of vehicle you're operating. And, that thing dominates your dynamics. You can kind of think of, as you're flying across country, looking out the window, I always say, that's kind of order how high you are above the seafloor if you're operating these vehicles at greatest depths. I mean, truthfully, the average depth of the ocean is something around, a little less than 4,000 meters. So you kind of get the picture. This tether is a really long tether, and it's remarkably high drag. Cylinders are very high drag. And so it really dominates it. And kind of the most complex part of the system actually is the tether and the tether management system, both in terms of building it and in terms of operating it. So getting rid of that tether is a really big deal. And that's what the AUVs did. So the AUVs sort of offered the promise of first making your ship more productive. As you could operate one vehicle off of a ship without a tether. So now I can use a smaller ship. Second, operate many of them off a ship. And so now you make your ship many times more productive. And then finally, don't use a ship. Send your vehicles out there and have them operate. And all of those things have come to pass. So there's some very deep economic motivators. And in the scientific side, there's a whole set of, and actually military as well, there's a whole set of reasons why multi-platform systems have almost overwhelming advantages for observation for certain classes of problem. In general classes of problem where your sensor power is very minimal. And so those are all things that for us, became sort of cumulatively sets of challenges. And so for us, we didn't really have an AI winter in that sense, because, first it was getting the vehicles to work. It was very hard, I would say, in the early days. it was kind of like we started in winter is sort of what I would say. It was very hard to raise money in the early days. And even when we started our company, Frank and I, the initial funding for the company was Frank and I emptied our respective piggy banks and just crossed our fingers, right? that the thing would get going, because there was no way that anyone was funding an AUV company at the same time that the dot-coms were being founded. But as the stuff started getting proven, the momentum just built and built. And so I think we haven't really seen in the marine side that winter. I've watched my colleagues go through this, and I think what it has to do with is there's this, of course it's timing, right? But what are the aspects of timing that are really critical? And one of them really revolves around, understanding kind of when you're ready to go to market. And I remember Frank and I actually considered starting Bluefin earlier. So Frank came out at one point in the early 90s. He spent a week or two with me. I went across to Europe. We spent a week touring around various oil and gas companies in Europe. And we got together, we wrote a business plan, we looked at it, and we said, it's not ready yet. The technology, we're gonna be spending all of our money developing the technology in the company. It's very high risk. We should just, revisit this in several years after Jim has had a chance to kind of, push this further along the lines. And sort of about, I guess, 96, I called up Frank and I said, Frank, it's time. And Frank had just started this fabulous new job, which he promptly quit and moved to Cambridge and bought a little house in Cambridge, and we started Bluefin. So I would say that those cycles, kind of come a little bit from an over-optimism, maybe, of what the technology can do, and not necessarily, a lack of understanding of how it's actually going to be used. So I think what you see is this enormous enthusiasm for building an autonomous car, right? And maybe a lack of understanding of just how tough that problem is, and also a little bit of a lack of understanding of what the business models are that might be sort of the intermediate steps that might allow you to sort of make incremental, progress towards the autonomous car that you're eventually gonna put out there. But yeah, I'm lucky in a sense, in that I started out so poor that it all looks wonderful to me. I think things can go downhill a lot and it still looks great.
Yeah, certainly. So Dr. Bellingham, you talked a bit about in the discussion on your career, engaging with the Office of Naval Research, engaging with the US Navy, and we mentioned a little bit of DoD. And I'd love to know your take on what the DoD's attitude on autonomous systems and capabilities has been historically over the course of your career, and how that attitude may have changed over the years. Essentially, is the DoD getting more or less risk averse? It's a hard question.
Yeah, so I would say that I have there are three sort of career eras for me, each of which kind of provide a slightly different perspective. So there's, my early career where I was, a practitioner funded by O&R, and that was my dominant window into DoD. And then I chaired NRAC for many years, and was on NRAC even longer. So I was on NRAC for, I think, for 10 years. It's a Naval Research Advisory Committee. And so that was the Senior Civilian Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee for the Department of the Navy. It was stood up in the late 40s. It was killed in the last administration, but it'll probably come back again. But for me, that was a fabulous window on what the challenges were, the technological challenges were for the Department of the Navy. And we did several autonomy studies. Kind of the second to last study we did was an autonomy study, which focused on a lot of these problems. And so and then more recently, I have to say that I'm kind of looking from the outside in, because I'm not running that committee anymore. So I don't have that viewpoint from within the system, as you will. So I would say in the early days, O&R was fabulous. I mean, I owe my career to O&R. You know, they take these really long-term problems and they fund them. You know, the ideal O&R, so there's a big difference between how O&R funds things and how NSF funds things. You know, people like to say NSF funds projects, O&R funds people. And that's true. And it's very hard to sort of get under the tent for O&R. And once you're under the tent, it's a lot of work to stay there, right? You know, if you don't show up for a cruise that you've committed to, you're out and you're never getting back in again. But the difference is on the technological side, you have continuity of funding from O&R that you don't from NSF. So NSF is typically like a 3-year project. How long does it take you to really move something from, you know, a back of the envelope sketch to reality? Probably 10 years. So that's, you know, 3 proposal cycles. You know, the first one is hard. The second one is even harder because they think they've already funded you. And so you don't look developmental anymore. So it's very hard to move technology from you know, all the way across the you know, the TRL levels under NSF funding. But O&R will do that. And O&R will be cognizant of the fact that you might have several people in your laboratory who know everything there is to know about this. And if they drop you on funding, you're going to have to drop them and they're going to go somewhere else and you're not going to get them back again. So they understand sort of the minutia, if you will, of lab management in a research organization. And what's more, O&R for me introduced me to people that I didn't know that I needed to know. So they introduced me to the ocean modelers, introduced me to some of the folks who were working on different aspects of control. And those led to incredibly strong collaborative efforts, you know, with people like Alan Robinson, who is one of the gods of oceanography, Russ Davis, who unfortunately, both of those gentlemen have passed away, Russ just recently. But they were, and they were, by the way, had diametrically opposite viewpoints, right, on a lot of the ocean modeling. So I would say, you know, O&R, my experience was truly instrumental in getting, in the ocean side, getting this all up and running. And what's more, when the stuff got real, they really twisted my arm to commercialize. I was not that enthusiastic about commercializing. I just wanted to license it and kind of move on. It turns out licensing things is very hit or miss. And so for a lot of reasons, you know, you know, it's not necessarily the fault of either partner, but it's not always the case that things are perfectly aligned to make that happen. It takes a lot of work to turn it into a real commercial enterprise. And so O&R was instrumental in that. And what's truly ironic, right, is in later years, when people would refer back to the companies that were born that way. And so there was Tom Curtin, there was another fellow, Tom Sween, and the two Toms were really good friends and supported different companies and different groups. But they, you know, they coordinated at O&R, so they were sort of on the same boat. As a matter of fact, when Tom went on a leave at one point, Tom Sween sort of stood in and took over managing, you know, his groups. It was really a pretty fabulous set of people that they had at O&R that really kind of shepherded this stuff all the way through. But the irony is that you would hear folks in sort of the big Navy refer to those as commercial systems, right? Because once they were commercialized, they started becoming adopted by the commercial world, right? And they hadn't been, you know, they didn't come out of Lockheed, they didn't come out of Raytheon. So I'd be in these meetings and they go, well, you know, we should be developing Navy systems. You know, right now we're buying all these commercial systems, because it's ironic, right? You know, for the Navy for many years, most of the AUVs that they used were the AUVs that came out of the academic research community, right? Whether it was Bluefin or Hydroid or these other small startups. And then on the autonomous surface craft side, it's really been a lot of private money that started that. So The Schmidt Foundation, I think, provided early funding for the sail drone folks. Liquid Robotics, which was kind of the original, wave-powered system, was funded, actually got VC funding. So for us, that was all a really big deal. And of course, it was started by VC, so they knew how to work that system. But those there was a real disconnect between O&R and the big Navy. So I would say the O&R did a really pretty fabulous job. The big Navy did a really lousy job at pickup, would be, kind of my, my comment there. And I later understood why when we had to run a review of the transition fund. There's a whole set of systemic problems, if you will, with 6.4, which is not managed by O&R. It's outside of O&R. So I won't go into, everyone always sort of, complains about the acquisition process. I frankly, from an innovation speed perspective, the problems are really sort of coupling the acquisition process to the to what's going on in laboratories, and that's where the acquisition speed bump occurs, if you will. Within, once I got into NRAC, you saw, for example, the setup of the Unmanned Systems Office. There were a whole set of challenges that we saw, which revolved around who got the AUV system. So I can remember Admiral Roughhead, did a set of reorganizations of, the Navy, Verger 2, N2 and N6 and so on. And I remember him commenting to me that the folks that really seemed to be able to use these AUVs were the were the folks in, I guess it was N6, right? Because that was where the oceanographic part of the Navy was from. It was a very small group of people. It was the place where they actually had some PhDs in uniform. And those folks kind of knew what to do with the vehicles, and they had a big problem and not a lot of money, and so they were willing to be very innovative. But the systems didn't have a killer app for the big Navy, sort of at that stage, and so as a consequence, there wasn't an obvious transition to a weapon system type program. You just needed this fairly lengthy period of experimentation with the technology. We understood how to do oceanography with it, but how are you going to use that in the context of the Navy's mission? Where does it fit in? I think there's some very good answers to that, but you need to actually work out all of the kinks and try them. If you just take the first systems, move them across and attempt them, you're inevitably going to encounter problems. You're going to give yourself a black eye. And there's a long history of products, which are really good products, getting introduced a little too quickly, developing a bad reputation, and then nobody wants to go near them. And so I think to a degree that maybe happened a little bit, with AUVs. And then the large defense contractors tend to all gravitate to really large platforms. And I think there's no question there's a whole set of things you can only do with really large platforms. But the really large platforms are not just expensive to buy, they're very expensive to operate, and they raise all of the risk levels of operations up to sort of the maximum levels. And so, launch and recovery at sea, particularly recovery, is a really tough problem, right? And so if what you do is you build a really large platform, you move those problems right to the forefront. So I always say, how far would aviation have gotten if you started out with carrier aviation? If you said, I don't want to operate off of, the land, let's start with landing on ships. Well, that would have been, we would have had our first airplane about, 1935. It would have taken a lot longer. So you can make these things very hard by imposing these requirements on the system, which make a lot of sense from an operational perspective, but which are not the right next technological step. And so I think you see a lot of that as well. I have my own strong sense of what I think. There's nobody sort of thinking strategically about that, largely because that unmanned system office was disbanded. So you don't have a champion, for these systems in that way. And ironically, right, if you read the history of the air vehicles, those really were championed outside of Department of Defense, right? It was really the intelligence community that figured out how to use those, which, by the way, blows my mind, because I can remember a graduate student friend of mine back in the 80s who was a tanker, who later went on to become Assistant Secretary for the Army for Acquisition. But I remember him telling me in the 80s that when he was on an exercise and he saw a UAV overhead, because they had UAVs back then, he said he knew he was dead, because the next thing that was going to happen was, they were going to get targeted by artillery. So he said, in an exercise, you really didn't want to see one of those things. So I remember going, oh, okay, unmanned systems, but it took, for some reason, it took years for that little nugget of knowledge, which was so obvious to an operator, to make it across to the whole system and sort of become incorporated in doctrine, become incorporated in, the acquisition process, and to be represented in the kind of kit which was actually deployed. So those are things that usually require a disaster to move the system. People refer to needing a Pearl Harbor. So I really hope we don't need a Pearl Harbor. It's interesting, right? I'm a big believer in small systems, and you watch what's going on in the Ukraine, right? And there's, a big discussion going on now is the tank dead, right? Did the Javelin kill the tank? And probably not, but it certainly enormously changed the dynamic, right? So, holy smokes, somebody keeps trying to call me. I apologize. My daughter. I'll pick up afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. Well, Dr. Bellingham, I wanted to try to sneak in 2 more questions before we wrap for the hour. But something that's come up over these conversations that we've had before in this series are the edge cases. You told us about some good voices to listen to regarding edge cases at the top of the hour, but edge cases and autonomous systems in the defense domain, how did that factor into your work with Bluefin and beyond? And I mean, I think a part of this is, right, like, is there an over-reliance on training data? Can we move away? How do we move away? And so on.
Yeah, so I would say, first of all, the autonomous systems started out ahead of everyone else, in the marine environment. But that dynamic changed, right, as the money moved into autonomous cars. So I would say right now, in the underwater world, the adoption of those machine learning techniques and deep learning is probably pretty far behind, the rest of the world, right? All of the money that's gone into vision systems, everything from processors to, gaming systems, and of course, the whole autonomous car industry has just brought billions of dollars to bear on that. So you don't have that kind of equivalent investment in underwater systems or acoustic systems. I know we're running low on time, but there's a whole set of interesting sort of case studies or vignettes, where I could talk about how that manifests itself, because people tend to move to vision systems when they don't make sense, just because they have the processing capability for it, and they have instruments on the shelf, if you will, they can use. But yeah, so it's clear that as you build, so the first thing that is clear is that if you have communications with your system, even a little bit of communications can go a long way in providing reliability if you can detect anomalous behavior. And then anomalous behavior might be your sensor system acting up, or some aspect of your vehicle, maybe even due to a mechanical failure. And so we did it, when we started building really long endurance platforms when I was out on the West Coast, and we started accumulating, many thousands of hours of operations, we had a long list of failures, and we could begin to ask the question of which of these failures are actually killers and which of these failures are easy fixes from shore. And it turned out by far the majority were easy fixes from shore. And even the ones that weren't easy fixes, even the hard fixes from shore, were things that could be done, where you got the vehicle back, got the vehicles. These were shore launch vehicles, so they were operating out for weeks at a time. You could get the vehicle back to shore, even though you'd had a substantial failure on the vehicle, if you have that comms. In the defense space, I think that, you are much, on the one hand, you have more money to spend on comms. On the other hand, you're operating environments where there may be reasons you don't get that comms. And so now you need to operate these vehicles without that small bit of human support that makes such a big difference. And what you find is that failures tend to cascade. And they tend to spawn other failures. So there's this classic Apollo 13 example, right? In Apollo 13, there was a bit of chaos there, right? When they had that initial explosion on the, of the fuel cell system. And all of the controllers are trying to figure out what's going on, and it's not making sense to any of them, despite the fact that they have, I don't know, hundreds or thousands of hours of training against different contingencies. Well, the thing is they never trained against contingencies that they thought would kill the astronauts. In effect, it's depressing and kind of why bother. And then they never trained against instances where they had multiple failures, or so I'm told by folks who were at NASA back in those days. And in this case, you had multiple failures. And so you had each person having a window into a set of failures, which kind of didn't make sense on its own until you sort of put it together in the larger picture. And in AUV systems, it tends to be like that as well. And so what you really need are so you need a couple of things. You need to be able to detect. I think that the failure detection and recovery is kind of the principal challenge, right, to this long-term autonomy. And what you need is, number one, to be able to tell that something's going wrong. We're actually pretty good at that. We can actually do that. And some of the simpler forms of machine learning, of unsupervised machine learning, are actually remarkably good at it. And then number two, you need to be able to, diagnose and mitigate the problem, and then figure out what that implies for your larger mission that you're trying to achieve. And so those are the things that are kind of unfinished business right now. And there's pieces of that machine learning, really helps you with, and there's pieces of that which are which may or may not be machine learning parts of it. They may have to do with developing more sophisticated digital twins that we connect across to system performance. That was in effect how we implemented the anomaly detector in those long duration platforms. So I think that we can make very successful systems, but we do have to solve, because this is where all of the simple missions become complicated, is when things don't go according to plan, and now the contingencies accumulate. And so that idea that you're going to anticipate all those contingencies ahead of time is just unrealistic, right? Because they combine in odd ways and bad things. We talk about emergent behaviors like they're a good thing, but in those cases they're often a very bad thing. So we need to develop more systematic approaches to this fault detection and recovery, and then in effect, what my planning friends would call replanning. It may or may not be a planning exercise, but it's certainly a refactoring exercise.
Sure, definitely. So, Dr. Bellingham, this has been a really great conversation. As we close, could you tell us a little bit more about some of the work that you and your team are doing at the Institute of Assured Autonomy?
Yeah, so I think that the core technological elements of this really revolve around questions of how you can modify the actual training process of your deep neural nets, in order to mitigate this problem of having this under-constrained system that kind of makes things up in part of the space. And those become the edge cases you're searching for and testing. So there's fundamental questions about that. There's fundamental questions of bias, or as my colleague Ramachalapa calls it, domain shift. And he would be a great speaker, by the way, because this is something that shows up in a variety of different ways. You train a system, let's say you have an acoustic system, you train it on a particular platform with a particular set of capabilities. You'd now like to apply it to another platform with a different set of capabilities. That data set doesn't look exactly the same. Machine learning is pretty specific, right? So it may not work so well, or there may be things that cause it to perform very badly. And so this domain shift problem, revolves around understanding how to build systems that can survive that shift, right, as you move across. And in the human medicine space, it shows up as you're trying to move from, your ivory tower big hospital out to sort of regional medical centers, or as you're dealing with people who have different medical characteristics, and you've trained against one class of characteristics. And there's a lot of racial bias in the existing data sets. And those things become things that we have to do. Those things become things that show up in our systems and we have to deal with. So bias, I would say Ramachalapa leads an effort there. Security is a really big part of this. I haven't talked about that much. There's extremely interesting work going on by Yair Amir on two things, really. One is I've now trained a machine learning system. I've done the best I can to deal with the edge cases, but I know it's still going to act quirky, and I want to use it in this critical application. So what can I do to get the advantages of having my machine learning system without exposing myself to something really bad happening? So, Yair has developed this approach called Radix, which runs basically two controllers side by side, a classical controller, which may not be great, but at least it's not going to blow up on you, along with the machine learning system, and it kind of knows when to switch over from one to the other. So a set of things like that. And so now we're beginning to connect across to, and there's 10 of these projects, right? There's a set of security things, sort of a Byzantine security approach being used by Yair on a DOE project, fabulously successful. I'm not sure if I can talk about the results, but let's just say only thing I saw that this team couldn't break into. So really great stuff going on there. And then as you start moving across, I'm a big believer of a lot of the problems in assurance don't show up until you start actually trying to build real stuff. And so we have activities going on in the medical domain, which we think are going to help us understand how people team with each other, and which information people in those teams need. Because a lot of the failures of autonomy really are failures of interactions with people, either in the person sort of conveying what it's really trying to do, or in the system understanding what information the person needs, or how to make the handoff occur, right? A number of the failures of automated systems are handoffs occurring badly. Autonomous car going, I don't know what to do, back to you. There's a person right in front of you, or an airplane. This has happened with that Air France that was lost in the Atlantic. So these are, and then there's the ethical piece. And so ethics is an extremely important part of this. So does it work as one question, but does it do something that we should do as another question? And this has very practical implications in the defense space for things like the escalation ladder and management. You have to have a common understanding with your enemies about how bad is bad, right? Or that communication which you're having through, an escalating series of activities may go very badly, because something that you think is not so bad, they think is really horrible, or vice versa. And that leads to an unconstrained escalation. And at the core of that is kind of an ethical discussion. And then, of course, the biomedical folks have been grappling, medicine has been grappling with this for millennia. So we've teamed with the Bioethics Institute here at Johns Hopkins and have a couple of joint faculty working on these problems to sort of think about these ethical issues, help us understand them, and begin to sort of think about how you move those across to policy. So these are, I mean, just there's a very broad range of activities, and something I now realize I didn't mention and I should have, is that when I say Johns Hopkins, I'm referring not just to the academic campus, but to the academic campus plus the applied physics lab. So the applied physics lab is an equal partner in here, as I mentioned. And one of the super interesting things to me is how autonomy changes as you move to the outer solar system, as you move beyond the asteroid belt and you start exploring the ocean worlds. And that's beginning to happen with things like the Dragonfly mission and Europa Clipper. And so there's some very interesting assurance problems there as you move to the end, if you will, the far ends of the solar system. So at any rate, a long answer to a simple question, but a lot of really great stuff going on and a lot of industry partnerships being in the process of being forged over the last year.
Absolutely. And like a lot of great topics to further this discussion. So Dr. Bellingham, thank you so much for joining me here today. It was a really great discussion, a really in-depth discussion. And I really appreciate how we were able to answer some of these questions and discussions on autonomy through the lens of your own career. And you've had a lengthy, distinguished career, and it was just awesome. So thank you so much for having this conversation here with me today.
Well, thank you. And I hope I gave you a couple of good names of people to go out and reach and talk to. I think the great thing about this field is it really has attracted a lot of interesting people. And so that's it's probably the best thing about working in research is you get to work on great problems with big applications and really interesting people. So good luck to you with this series, and I look forward to following your next set of talks.
Thank you.